I broke through the carbonate, that's how I got free. Drop it back off because there's no stopping me. Postmodern player, sample-tastic, flows ekphrastic. I get drastic, hey, watch the plastic. Yo, I name check and leave you drastic.
This is Spencer, and this is The MacGuffin, and I'm joined by Bob Ingersoll, one of the subjects of the film Project Nim, which is playing here at SIFF. Before we start talking about the film itself, why don't we sort of give a little bit of backstory on you and what the film is actually about?
Well, the film's about a chimpanzee that was born in Norman, Oklahoma in 1973, and I happened to be a graduate or an undergraduate student at the University of Oklahoma at a few years after Nim was born, and Nim was sent to New York to be in a sign language research project at Columbia University. And while he was in New York, I landed in Norman, Oklahoma, and became a student of Roger Fouts's. And then Nim came back to Oklahoma, where I had then been for a few years working with chimpanzees, and Nim came back from New York, and that's where I met him.
And so you had been working with animals before he got there. Was that something you had long been interested in? How did you sort of end up down that sort of career path, so to speak?
Well, no, it wasn't something that I had intended. My intention was to be an orthopedic surgeon, and I had my plan was pretty set. And one day I was in a zoology class at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, about a year before I went to Oklahoma or so. And I heard about Washoe, a signing chimpanzee that was at the University of Oklahoma. And I was intrigued, as many people were, about the opportunity to see another animal use language. And so very shortly after that, as things kind of turned out, I was at the University of Oklahoma very shortly after that and met Roger Fouts and then Washoe and the signing chimps. And then I thought, man, I don't want to be an orthopedic surgeon. I want to do whatever it is that this is. And so, and here I am 35 years later.
It's definitely an amazing and interesting story. But, the topic of animal research is always one that is a hot button issue. Were you sort of like conscious of that kind of stuff back then? Or, obviously I'm sure you are now, but what was it like at that point?
Well, in 1975 or so, when I became involved, the animal rights movement had just kind of gotten off the ground here in the United States. And a guy named Alex Pacheco, who did PETA, who created PETA, had just been involved in an incident called the Silver Springs monkeys. And so no, I wasn't as aware or in tune to the animal rights / animal welfare idea. But shortly after that, things just kind of picked up, and in no time at all, I became not only familiar, but I now am, probably as entrenched in animal welfare and animal rights as anyone. And so it's kind of my calling, let's say. I didn't know that at the time, but it was a young and just a developing area. It's still developing, actually. It still doesn't have legitimacy at the academic level. It still hasn't received the kind of attention and funding that it should in terms of serious science, because this animal welfare has to do with sanctuaries and what we do with animals after we're finished with them in science. And the scientists, unfortunately, up until the early 70s, hadn't really thought about that. So those are the things that over the next 10 years or so became, like you said, hot button issues, because animals, people care about them.
Yeah. And that's sort of an interesting thing. You talk about, you were sort of right place, right time when Nim was coming to Oklahoma. Had you always been an animal person, or what exactly was it that sort of drew you into this story? Did you find the research to be a really innovative avenue to go? Were you just always an animal kid growing up? How did you get sucked into this world?
Well, I wasn't an animal kid, and like everybody, you've been around a dog or a cat or whatever, mostly dogs, and no, I'm from Boston, so I didn't really have a lot of exposure. We had a dog named, my grandparents had a dog named Smokey, and we had some, dogs in our house, but no, it didn't occur to me. And then I read about and heard about Washoe, the sign language chimpanzee, and the enthusiasm that the graduate student that told me about it in our little class kind of turned me on to it. So when I arrived in Oklahoma and Roger Fouts was the first professor I encountered, pretty much the first day of class, the first day of school, I guess a light bulb went off in my head. My grandfather had an interaction with a non-human primate, with a monkey, but I thought it was a chimpanzee back when I was 6 years old, which was real. I guess it really made an impact on me, because when I was 6 years old, my grandfather took me to a department store called the Orbit, and it's like a Target or Walmart, one of the first ones. And in that store at the time, they had sold pets, and evidently they had monkeys, which I thought was a chimpanzee for a long time, but it was a capuchin monkey, I'm pretty sure now, because I know what a capuchin monkey is. And when my grandfather hit the door of that place, he reached into his suit pocket, because he was one of those guys that wore a suit all the time, and pulled out some gum. And when he pulled the gum out, the monkey and he had an interaction from about 6-10 aisles away. And at that point, and then we walked back there, and my grandfather interacted with this animal, which I thought was a chimpanzee, because capuchins are actually are very, very similar to chimpanzees in a lot of ways in their behaviors, and they're a lot more sophisticated than had been generally thought, until recently, actually. So that's probably the first time I ever got sucked into a non-human primate situation, and never really thought about monkeys or any of that, never was really into them at the zoo or any of that sort of thing. So that might have been in the back of my mind. And when I met Roger, and then I saw that same sort of interaction going on, and then virtually 2 or 3 days after I met Roger, I was actually with Nim's oldest brother, Allie, and another chimp named Vanessa. And if it's going to happen, it's going to happen within the first couple of minutes of you being around a chimp. You either are going to be able to be into it, or it's going to be very intimidating and something that you probably don't want to have a lot to do with. So, and for me, it was like, wow, how do I get to do this forever? So it was,
So it's sort of funny to think, like, in some ways the enthusiasm of a graduate student sort of dramatically changed the course of your life.
Exactly. That, and I don't even know what his name was, and I can't even remember what he looked like, to be perfectly honest with you. I just remember that day, and I remember thinking in my mind as he's saying all that, what it would be like to actually talk, because, at that time I didn't realize that it wasn't exactly talking. It was more communicating with one another about needs and wants and desires. But at that time, I didn't know any of that. And so, yeah, it was one of those things that it just falls into place. It could have been, I could have had somebody else for a psych professor or any number of things, and we'd be, you'd be interviewing me about my orthopedic surgery research or whatever right now, instead of about Nim.
So, you take these turns in your life, you end up working with Nim. What was that experience like? I mean, that was really sort of very, I don't know it's cutting edge at the time, what was going on, but it doesn't seem like, and maybe I'm just not aware of it, but it seems like that stuff just isn't occurring today. It seems like a lot of that research has sort of just been dropped.
You're right. It doesn't occur today. There is one program that still goes on, and it's run by Sue Savage Rumbaugh, who is an ex-colleague of mine, or came before me at Oklahoma. She's now at Iowa, and she works with bonobos, Kanzi and Panpanetia, and several others at Des Moines, Iowa, at the University of Iowa. But for the most part, after Nim, and because Herb wrote a book that said that he had failed to teach Nim sign language, and for a variety of reasons in science, when you get a negative result and the rest of the scientific world accepts that negative result, then funding for something that has had a negative result is going to be less likely than something that had a positive result. So if Herb had written a book that said, it's interesting what we got from Nim. It might not be language, but he's definitely naming objects and communicating and doing some things. And what we need to do now is, because our methodology was somewhat flawed, we now need to tease out of this what exactly Nim's doing. He's definitely communicating, and he's definitely naming objects, but we're not sure about the language thing. Instead, Herb wrote the book and said, he's mimicking, he's imitating, he's not spontaneous, he doesn't know language, and this isn't communication, this isn't sentences, this isn't grammar, and we're done. And that's what happened.
And it's sort of a shame, because you think about it in terms of scientific method or something. I mean, this is a one sort of case example that it's sort of amazing to think that just because one test case might not have worked to the expectations of the study, but I mean, it seems flawed to assume that just because one time didn't work, all times wouldn't work.
Right, and I agree. And I think that if you were speaking about something that was a little more mainstream, you probably could have gotten a little more funding to do it again here and there. But we're talking about teaching sign language to a chimpanzee. This is a minefield. We're talking from evolution to religion to any number of topics that people don't want to deal with. They don't want to deal with, wow, we're just like them. They're just like us. Wow. What about using them in labs? What about medical research? What do we do? What about killing them in the wild for meat? The kind of things that humans don't really want to, kind of deal with, because we don't want to accept animals as equals. Because if we accept them as equals, then we have to treat them equally in terms of at least their habitat destruction and the way we treat them in labs. If they're not equals, we can treat them any way we want. So in the United States anyway, animals are property. All the way up to chimpanzees, gorillas, orangs, they're property, and they're treated like property, which is distressing to me.
Yeah, I mean, I've read some amazing books talking about, the origins of circuses and all that stuff, where they kill or they capture 5,000 animals and take them over to the U.S. and by the time they got here, 500 or something would be alive
or less.
Yeah, it's sort of absurd to think about in some ways, but I mean, this is definitely a fascinating story. But it happened a long time ago, or it began a long time ago. What has taken so long, sort of, to get this story to be, fascinating to a generation again? I mean, why I guess it's the same question, and we can talk briefly, or we will talk about, James Marsh and Man on Wire. It's sort of how do these things get forgotten?
Well, that's a good question, because to me, it was never forgotten, and I maintained a level of intensity that was probably a lot more than the other people that I was trying to get to pay attention to it wanted. My own university ignores this and tries to pretend like it didn't happen. Nim was born in Norman, Oklahoma, and my own university, the University of Oklahoma, to this day wants to deny that they had any responsibility in any of this. I mean, I met these chimps through my connection to the university. So I don't know. That's a darn good question, and it just seems like some of these controversial subjects that don't have an answer, and that we have maybe done something that might be considered wrong. We really did. We wronged these chimps. And for us to now go back and revisit that wrong is an admission of our, let's say, our collective guilt. And at the level of my own university, even my own friends that worked with the chimps are really unwilling to even talk about this for the most part. It was very difficult to get. James did a darn good job in getting as many people to talk about it as he did. And Elizabeth Hess, who wrote the book that the movie's based on, did equally well, because it took a long time for us to want to open up. It's very emotional. I mean, those chimps are not just chimps; they're our friends, and so it became personal,
And so it's just it's distressing to people to think about negative subjects. So we just sort of find it easier to forget about them? I mean, I'm not saying, like, obviously some of this was intentional, but I mean, do you think, like, it's just amazing to me that such a notable study, such a notable, like, series of events can all just be sort of forgotten. But, like, for me, it's not even like that I forgot it. It's just I never heard about it until this. And it's sort of like, how can we avoid mistakes if we don't teach these kind of things? Isn't that the whole point, is to learn from your mistakes?
And that's virtually what I've been saying for quite a number of years to my own university, to anyone that would listen, to Jim Mahoney at LEMCEP, who, if you've seen the film, you know who Jim is. And fortunately for me and fortunately for the chimps, Jim had one of those aha moments. He had an epiphany where he realized, wow, Bob's right. Mm-hmm. We should examine this on a different level. And so fortunately for me, Jim Mahoney was one of those people who was willing to revisit the past and our collective sins, let's say, and the wrong that we did to those chimps, and he was willing to revisit that enough to at least help some of them, and he's still pretty much dogged by a lot of people saying that he did all these horrible things, but he indeed at some point had like I said, that epiphany and opened the door for quite a few of those chimps to actually find their way to sanctuary. So something that none of the people that actually worked with the chimps could pull off. And
so, how does this story sort of become a movie ultimately? Do you, I'm assuming you tell someone, ultimately a book gets written and somebody passes along that book to somebody else and eventually it ends up in somebody's hands. How exactly did that unfold for this?
Well, I had been talking about the OU chimps for, ever since they were sold to medical research. So I pretty much went on this crazy person campaign, and everybody thought pretty much I was crazy because I should have just let it go and leave it behind me, and I couldn't. And so in 1986, a book was written by a guy named Eugene Linden, and it was called Silent Partners, The Legacy of the Ape Language Experiments. And it was pretty harsh, and it told the truth, and it said what happened. And it talked about what our plan was, which was to buy all the chimps and bring them to Florida. Of course, that was extremely premature in history. I mean, that's happened now. There's a sanctuary in Florida that very similar to what we had proposed, but it came 20 years later. So what happened was that book came out, got some attention, but not much, and then nothing happened for a long time, and the chimps kind of languished in labs until a little bit more of an uproar about what's going on chimps in research and in AIDS research and this and that. And then, fortunately for me, Elizabeth Hess came along and ran into Stephanie Lafarge doing another story about another issue. And Stephanie was Nim's first mother. And so Elizabeth asked Stephanie, how did you get into the animal world? And Stephanie said, well, I worked with this chimpanzee named Nim. And the story was about dogs, about what Stephanie does with her work now with the ASPCA and dogs. However, as soon as Elizabeth heard Nim, she went, wow, that's a great idea. I want to know more about Nim. And so shortly after that, she got in contact with me through, she wrote me a letter, which I didn't even read for about 6 months because, well, I just didn't. And but when I did read it, I immediately contacted her and I said, wow, you want to write a book about Nim? And so maybe we should meet. And so we met in Norman, Oklahoma, and where I actually helped to operate a monkey sanctuary called Mindy's Memory. And but I live in San Francisco. And she came and met me. We hung out for about a week. She interviewed a bunch of people in Norman. And then for the next 6 years, she wrote the book. And I helped her when I could. I provided her pictures and contacts. And then in 2008, the book came out. Got a little bit of attention. It it's a narrow topic, so it's not like George Bush bestseller or anything like that, or Barack Obama or any of that sort of thing. The kind of books that now, are pretty much, books are different now than they were when I was a kid, and people don't read even. So it's a whole nother world. And so when the book came out, NPR and a few people did stories, and a London newspaper did a story, and Simon Chin, the producer's wife, read the story. She was pregnant at the time and very emotionally attached to Nim as soon as she read the article. At least that's from what I understand. I'm actually going to meet her next week, and I'm going to give her a big hug and tell her thank you, thank you, thank you. And so she handed the book to Simon. Simon read the book, gave it to James. James and Simon talked. They optioned the book from Elizabeth Hess, and then they got a hold of me, and then Simon and I worked out a deal, and James and I talked. He came to San Francisco. We liked each other a lot, and shook hands, and 2 years later, here we are.
So how gratifying is it, after all these years, after, being the only one who would talk about this, to finally, have someone as notable as James Marsh come on and direct your film, be taking your film to all these festivals, telling the story that you've been trying to get out there for so many years. What is it like to finally be able to have sort of a platform for your message?
Well, it's really more about letting people get to know Nim, because Nim is the message. I mean, and I don't even have to talk about my message. Nim does that for me. All you have to do is meet Nim, and then you get it, why I'm where I am and why I'm sitting here. I mean, and I think for most of the audience, they can easily put themselves in my shoes, and they can at least see themselves doing what I did, as opposed to doing nothing. And so yeah, it's real gratifying to have someone as accomplished and as artistically talented, and someone as smart, and someone who actually gets it and understands Nim, because it's not about me. It's really about Nim and how he interacted with the people around him, and how he shaped or he changed or he made them do things that they would not necessarily do. And for me, it is very gratifying to see Nim become such a symbol of righteousness, and of everything good, as opposed to having, for years people called him Dim Chimpsky and said, oh, that's that chimp that didn't learn sign language. But the reality is that not only did he learn sign language, but he learned how to be in our world as well as any chimp ever. And when you see the film, you see that. It's pretty clear that Nim is an extraordinary being, and his personality is so strong, and it's so out there for you to be able to access. And so for James to come along and let the world now access that, and to get a feel for what it's like to not be a human, and to have to deal with a world that's controlled by humans, and to be able to put yourself so well into that mold. James did a phenomenal job of making Nim the main subject of this film, and that was difficult. It would have been easy to make the hippie guy that smokes pot with the chimp and all that. And it is cute and all those sorts of things. But this film isn't just about that. It's about a lot of different things. It's about how our culture operates on a number of levels, about power, about education, about the male-female, interactions within a power situation, all those things. So, like I said, it was a minefield, and James is, I guess he's got that little like mind detector or whatever, because he and Simon, and their team, and all of the people that work with these guys are truly phenomenal and quite talented, and pinch me. I feel very, very fortunate. And now these guys are, not only have I worked with them, but now they're my pals, and I couldn't be more happy for Nim, and for all chimps, because I think this is going to help all chimps, not just chimps in captivity, but all chimps, so I'm thrilled.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. Check out the film Project Nim when it comes to a theater near you. Great message, great film, and we wish the best for you and the film.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
T-1000 can't stop me. I'm on fire tonight. Magneto can't stop me. I'm on fire tonight. Even Zod can't stop me. I'm on fire tonight. It's tight. Don't even try to bite the side of style. Mr. Spock can't stop me. I'm on fire tonight. The Wrath of Khan can't stop me. I'm on fire tonight. The Borg can't stop me. I'm on fire tonight. Because I've got space game and it feels alright.